The soil you put into your raised beds can make a big difference in the success of the plants that you're growing in them. Join me today as I show you how I fill my metal raised bed. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this is one of my metal raised beds from Forever Garden Beds. One of the biggest advantages to raised bed gardening is that you get to choose the soil that you put into your raised beds. You're not left to the mercy of Mother Nature and whatever you are given in the ground. And here in Colorado, the ground soil is pretty bad, but the soil in my raised beds is pretty good. When I fill my beds, I approach it as though I'm baking a cake in my kitchen. I follow a general recipe, but just like there are many different types of cakes, there are many different ways that you can fill your raised bed. I like to follow a basic method of layering, putting in multiple ingredients one layer at a time. And when it's all done, the cake, or in this case, the raised bed, is tasty. Tasty for all those soil microbes, because that's what I want in this soil. I want a good, healthy soil, and I'm providing the food for all of those microbes that are going to benefit my plants. The first layer begins with small to medium-sized tree branches. And I'm using what I have here in Colorado, so that means they're primarily pine and aspen with a few elm and miscellaneous species thrown in. Now, this bed is 17 inches tall. I want enough room for the plant roots to grow. I'm planning on putting tomatoes in this bed, so that means at least 12 inches of soil. So those branches are only filling about the bottom 4 to 5 inches. I like to start with the tree branches in my raised beds for a number of reasons. First, I don't want to fill this whole bed with expensive soil, especially when the roots aren't going to be growing at the very base. So those branches fill some of that space that doesn't need to be filled by soil. As they decompose, they're going to add nutrients to the soil. That's a great thing. They'll also entice some of those wonderful soil organisms like earthworms to enter the bed from below. And especially in a dry region like mine here in Colorado, as those branches decompose, they act like sponges. They'll absorb water and hold onto it. So that bottom layer can actually help the entire bed stay evenly moist, even at the peak of summer in very hot sun. On top of those branches, I add my native soil. I try to fill in all the gaps around those branches by using the soil that I also already have. This is the area where I got my native soil. Now, this soil is very low in nutrients and very low in organic matter, but it rests right next to a tree, and branches and leaves have fallen in this area for years, which means there's probably a lot of fungal activity. It's the fungus in our soil that works to break down those leaves and those branches. So by using a soil from nearby a tree in my raised bed, I'm incorporating some of those fungal spores that will help those branches break down over time and should benefit the overall health of the bed. Now, along with Mala's help, I just cleared out this area. I was also not worried about any grasses or leaves or weeds that I was digging up and using to fill my wheelbarrow. All of that's going to be at the very bottom of the bed. It's going to be buried by at least 12 inches. So I'm not at all worried about any weed seeds that might be in this soil, because that's just too deep for any of those weed seeds to germinate. With a few wheelbarrow loads of my native soil, I was able to fill in all of the gaps around those branches. and cover them completely. Using the same basic idea of having wood at the base of the bed, I then added a thin layer of wood chips. And it really doesn't matter, but again, I used the wood chips that I had. And then I began adding some of the nutrient-rich soil that I have. I have a soil blend that consists of compost and humus and topsoil. And that's what I started layering into this metal raised bed. After a few inches of that amended soil, I then added a layer of compost. Now, I don't have enough compost that I've made to fill these raised beds, so I did use bags of purchased mushroom compost. After a few inches of that compost, I then added another layer of the amended topsoil. And on top of that, I added another layer of compost. At about the halfway point, I added some biochar. I like having a little bit of biochar in my beds because it acts as a repository for some of the beneficial soil microbes and nutrients, and also helps retain some of the water. On top of the biochar, I added more compost. And then I added a layer of fertilizer. I like the IV Organic 333. So I sprinkled a layer throughout the bed of that organic fertilizer. Now, I don't normally use fertilizer in all of my beds, but I filled this bed in the spring to ensure that the plants have enough nutrients, particularly nitrogen. I added the fertilizer because a lot of the ingredients are pretty rough. As they decompose, they're going to require nitrogen from the soil. So by adding more nitrogen to the soil, I help avoid a nitrogen deficiency when my plants begin to grow. You can see how the layers of this cake are all coming together. And like a really tall chocolate cake, think of it as a layer of cake, a layer of ganache, another layer of cake, and that's basically what I'm doing with the compost and the topsoil blend, and then all those other ingredients that I'm throwing in. So on top of that last layer of compost, I added a layer of my topsoil blend and another thin layer of my native soil. Because while I have all that fungal activity on the bottom, I also want some of it at the top. On top of my native soil, I added a layer of leaf mold. Now this is leaf mold that I made myself, and it has a lot of fungal activity, also helping to introduce the fungi from above. And then on top of the leaf mold, I added another final layer of compost that is about 2 inches deep, and that's the top of the growing surface. But of course, you have to frost the cake, and I do that with mulch. I start with straw. I cover the entire bed with a layer of straw, and then I add leaves. I try to crush the leaves up, and then I will mix them together. The mix of the leaves and the straw helps hold it all together in my windy environment. And then I finish it all off with a good watering. Now, I've been watering at regular intervals as I was filling the bed, but this final watering helps hold all of the mulch in place and ensures the bed stays moist. Now, it looks like my recipe is done and that the cake is complete, but part of making a cake is putting it in the oven. It needs to bake for a period of time, and after filling a raised bed, the same basically needs to happen. It needs to sit for a period of time. So the soil can warm here in spring, but so that the soil microbes can also populate this bed and begin releasing the nutrients from all that organic matter that I put in place. So I like to have at least a month from the time I fill my metal raised bed until the time that I put plants in. And I've allowed myself that much time. That's why this bed is already filled and sitting, waiting for plants. 6 weeks is a little better, 2 months is better still. The more time you can give your beds to develop those beneficial populations of microbes and earthworms and all the other beneficial insects, the more your plants will appreciate it in the end. In a month or so, I'll start putting my tomato plants in this bed. I have no doubt they're going to be very successful because my recipe benefits the soil and the plants. It doesn't have to be exact, but the idea and the concept and the recipe you use will benefit from multiple ingredients. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.